Good evening, CTK family. Good evening. We're going to keep you guys talking, keep that fellowship going out there. If you notice, we have some slides here that have flowers, so that's going to go along with our weekly Wednesday night question. This week's question is, what is your favorite flower? And if you want to add to it, maybe add to where your favorite place is to buy that flower. So look to your person on your left and right and discuss this answer.
As much as I hate spiders, I like spider mums because they're big and big white. They got
Oh, I know what you're talking about. They have those.
yeah.
Those big spiders.
Yeah, well, they look like mums, giant mums, but they're longer pieces.
Oh.
You see it in a lot of weddings, white or yellow. Yeah. I'm not a pink person, so.
I like lilies.
Yeah.
They're easy to grow, hard to kill.
Yeah.
All right. It's time to get started with our family Wednesday night service here at Christ the King Community Church. Okay, coming up on the horizon this Sunday coming up is Pentecost Sunday. And Pastor wants you to wear red. If you have any red garments, wear red. And then the following Sunday, so the next one, it will be our graduation Sunday, where we're going to be honoring 4 different graduating seniors this year. So that'll be fun. And that's coming up. At this time, we're going to ask you to stand to your feet. And those of you that are willing and able, let's lift up our voices. Let's give God some praise tonight. Amen. Take a moment, shake your neighbor's hand, tell him you're glad to see him tonight. you may be seated. How many of you guys have heard of the pastor named Andy Stanley? All right, so a couple people have. He's got I think his dad is a little bit more popular. What was his name? Charles Stanley. So Andy Stanley is a guy I kind of follow there online. And this video we're watching is a little clip of one of his sermons that talks about story and the importance of telling our story. Check it out.
I'd like to try to bridge the gap between those extraordinary stories, even those extraordinary Old and New Testament stories, and our story. Because the principle is the same. The principle is the same. That in your life, when you look back on your life, let me tell you what you're going to look back on. You're not going to look back on, well, I had a 5-year goal and I accomplished my 5-year goal, then I went to the next 5-year goal. I mean, I'm all for goal setting, but that's not the story you're going to tell. The story that you're going to tell when you tell your children your story, or if you have the opportunity to tell your grandchildren your story, you're going to tell a story about opportunities came along and you sensed God moving you to take advantage of those opportunities, and you were scared to death because there was risk involved. And taking advantage of those opportunities, in other words, those individual single acts of courage, will be the tipping point in your personal life for the things that God does. That's extraordinary. And no one may ever read your story, and they'll never make a book, make a movie about your story, and it's not going to be a David and Goliath kind of thing, and you're not going to be a high-profile leader perhaps. But when you tell your story is going to contain this same dynamic. There will be moments when an extraordinary, in your world extraordinary, an extraordinary step of faith, we call them, an extraordinary act of obedience, we call it, an extraordinary expression of courage will be the tipping point for perhaps the extraordinary thing that God wants to do in your life. And here's my desire for you. I don't want you to miss it. I don't want you to look back and say, if only I had. And I don't want there to be such a gulf between the heroics of King David and Moses and Abraham and those larger than life Old Testament characters. I don't want the gap to be so large that you look at their story and say, yeah, well, if I was in their situation, when in fact, you'll face some Red Seas of your own, you know that. You'll face some Goliaths of your own, you know that. You'll face some moments when you're going to want to back down because of terror of your own. And in those moments, your decision, whether or not you obey, whether or not you step out, will really determine whether or not you miss the defining moments of your life, the opportunities that perhaps God wanted to use to do something extraordinary through you. Because when you look back on the extraordinary work of God in your life, I promise you, there will be fear involved. There will be courage involved. And you'll look back and say, that's exactly right. There was a tipping point. And what hung in the balance was a mystery, but part of what hung in the balance was my willingness to step out and say yes to God when all the circumstances around me said, don't you dare take that much of a risk.
I think it's very important for us to tell our stories. Everybody's details in life are different, but we have all experienced things that we can show where God was at in our story. And it's very, very important that we tell those stories to our kids, that we tell those stories to our friends, that we tell those stories to our family, so that they can see the evidence of God in us. At this time, we're going to go ahead and dismiss to our small groups, and we're going to turn the service over to Brother Andy Burns.
Good evening. Okay, everybody able to hear me? Okay. Now that I can see all of you, I was sitting in front, so I think the woot I got must have been Jill. She's my surrogate church mom, cheering me on. Yes, ma'am.
what I feel like, what I want to do is to just go to my place.
Wow. Yes.
And I'm going to pray for the same thing. Same thing for my daughter's school. And anything that she shares the story beautifully. And we're blessed by it. And I'm blessed by it. I had a person say to me yesterday that in 44 years having lived more life than a lot of people live to me. That's the truth. I mean, so I just am thankful that I could get my big girl pants on and get here tonight. So this is where I used to be. I used to be here.
Amen.
I am blessed. I still am blessed, and I'm not going to let the adversary have any of that. So I'm just thankful that Jesus loves me, and I'm thankful.
All right. That's a great testimony. We love you, and we're glad you're here. And anybody that knew Heather couldn't help but love her either. So she was an inspiration and still is. So we're going to talk about this present world. If at any point you can't hear me, let me know. I have a tendency to not talk loud enough. And what we're going to discuss tonight, just a couple basics. A lot of it is just going to be a refresher for most of you. Bear with me just a second here, make sure everything's working. And so on our first slide here, this present world, that's the title of the study tonight. Our text begins with, but doesn't focus on this verse from 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. Some of the saddest words in the Bible, Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 4:10. He said, "For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world." Now, we don't really know what that is about, what the details are. We've got some speculation, but without making that a separate study of our own, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. So the question comes up, what does this world have to offer? And while we're talking about it, who is the God of this present world? You may be surprised. In our next slide, I came across this sticker affixed to a window right here in Fredericktown, and it really stood out to me. It's even got a cute little heart-shaped earth you can see there. Believe there is good in the world. How many people believe there's good in the world? A few people believe there is or can be. Okay. All right. Does anybody believe that saying that there's good in the world, is that contrary to our fundamental beliefs? Is it fundamental to the fact that we live in a fallen world and we're in need of a Savior? Can we agree with that maybe a little bit? Okay. Somebody say no?
No.
You can't agree with that?
No, the Jesus says there's none good, no, not one.
Okay, thank you. We're going to get to that. It's so nice to have feedback. You know, in the Ignite class, I bribe them with candy. So if they answer the trivia questions, and I almost brought candy, Chelsea and Ava couldn't be here tonight, and then I realized, I can't have her give out candy to people that give the right answers because there's no food allowed in the sanctuary. So any chocolate that gets on the floor is on me. So anyway, thank you, Emily. All right, so then the question is, okay, you brought this up. You kind of beat me to the punchline, which is okay. Can a person be good? And we know the answer is no, right? Paul says there's no righteous, no, not one, from Romans 3, right? He says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if we go back even further into the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 20, for there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Right? So this goes back a little ways. This isn't really anything new. So when we review our fallen state and how it began, we got to go back to which book? Here's an easy one for you. This would get you a candy bar. Go back to the book of Genesis. And here's a fun fact for you in case you're ever in the cash cab. Genesis is one of the two most hated books by whom? Atheist and the devil, right? It's the most attacked book in the Bible. Have you noticed that? No other book is attacked as ferociously as the book of Genesis. And the reason for that is because Genesis demonstrates and reveals Lucifer's design, how he works. So if we look at Genesis 3 in particular, we're going to see how it begins with the devil casting doubt to perpetrate a lie. In verse 1 of chapter 3, he says, has God said you'll die? So he casts this doubt. We all remember this, right? A little bit of a refresher here. Verse 4, he goes on to say, and this is where the first lie comes in. That's the doubt that he casts first, is, has God really said that? Is that really what he meant? Is that what you're taking from this? Well, here comes the lie. You won't really die. Then he drives it home with his final pitch. He says, the day you eat from the tree, your eyes will be open, and you'll be like gods. So this is the pivotal moment, right? This is when everything changes. God had given Adam dominion over the entire earth, right? Every tree, every beast, every seed, every plant, everything on earth, he's given dominion. So if you look at the next slide, the first man ends up making a choice that will affect the rest of humanity and essentially hands the earth over to Satan. Our next slide. When we ask ourselves who the prince of this world is, we can look at it like this. Think of a landlord-tenant relationship. Anybody here ever own a rental property? Anybody here ever seen a situation where a landlord has a rental property and it becomes a nightmare for him? I'll give you an example. Lonnie knows what I'm talking about, right? Believe it or not, this is one of the most common calls police officers deal with is you have a landlord who says, hey, come out here and kick this person out. Well, who is this person? Well, it's not the guy I rented to. I had a contract with this guy. I don't know where he is, but now it's this guy. And maybe that first guy that actually had a contract, maybe he let his buddy move in, he was down on his luck or whatever. But he has essentially turned over authority to the premises that are owned by this landlord. The ownership is not in doubt. Just like the ownership of this earth is not really in doubt. We know that God created this world, right? But he handed the authority, the dominion, the ownership over to Adam, who in turn hands it right over to Satan. So we ask ourselves, is Satan the God of this world? And keep in mind, that's God little g. What do we think? Is he the God of this world? We've heard him called the prince of this world. There is only one God, big G. And we're not denying God's sovereign role. If we look at the next slide, we realize he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? Every beast of the field is his. Every bird on every mountain is his. So we're not disparaging God. We're not taking anything from God. We know that essentially the world is his and the fullness thereof. Everybody remember that verse? That's a common one. Most people know that one from Psalms. So he has not replaced God, even though Satan would love to replace God. That's been his idea all along. And he is a counterfeiter. But he has usurped Adam's position, which was given to him by God. So how do we know? And Lonnie's right. There is only one God, but now we're talking God with a little g. So on our next slide, the prince of this world. I picked this one because you'll see in the next slide, we get really misled by what Satan might look like. I think this is probably a little more accurate. He's the prince of this world. He's a fallen angel. And of course, the best way to verify what's in the Bible is to use what? How do we proof anything that's in the Bible? How do we demonstrate that this part of the Bible is true? We'll use the rest of the Bible, right? And so if we look at John 12:31, Jesus says, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. Who's he talking about? Satan. Again in John chapter 14, verse 30, hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world cometh and hath nothing in me. He says 2 chapters later, John 16:11, when he's talking about the comforter to come, he says of judgment because the prince of this world is judged. Paul reinforces it when he writes, wherein in times past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Does anybody see examples of disobedience today? Is that a little bit of a problem? 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul tells us, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. So in our next slide, just in case you had any doubt, even though Jesus acknowledges that this is the God of this world, the prince of this world, there's only two entities to whom Jesus ever designated the term God. And who are they? His heavenly Father is one, and Lucifer is the other, right? Everybody remember when he's tempted in the wilderness and Satan takes him up and shows him the kingdoms of the world? What do you remember about that particular temptation? That he takes him up, he says, bow to me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. Jesus never refutes that. You don't find that curious? He never looks at him and says, well, they're not yours to give, right? There's no contradiction there. He offers him the kingdoms of the world, and the reason is because they are his to give, right? Because God has allowed it, yes. Correct. Yes, and that's why we want to make sure we emphasize he has limited power. God is omniscient, he is omnipresent. Satan is none of those things. He is a created being, and he is subject to God. So keep in mind, that's also, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is this ideology in the world that there is a yin and yang, that the evil in Satan is the dual opposite, a dualism kind of ideology, that you have God, you have the devil. But make no mistake, they are not equals, right? We all agree with that. Okay, so very limited power, he is a lesser being, right? So in our next slide, this may be a little more familiar to most people. This is the image we're generally given when it comes to the devil, right? Who would welcome somebody that looks like that into their home and sit at their dinner table? Because I sure wouldn't, right? It's pretty repulsive. What's that?
It's sick that they got children and stuff.
I'm glad you noticed that. I was going to save that for the last part, but that's the only accurate thing about this picture, is that he does want our children, right? Right. And this is really kind of a plagiarized scene. By the way, this is at the Satanic Temple in Detroit. This is a real monument, okay? Baphomet, by the way, is an Old English word, a medieval term for God. But we refer to like a half goat, half man as a Baphomet. Not a word really used a lot today. But here he is depicted this way, and it's completely plagiarized from the scene of Jesus, right? What do we remember about Jesus when the disciples tried to kind of hinder the children? He said, let them come to me, right? Suffer the little children. So is it any big surprise that he would counterfeit such a beautiful scene we have when we think of Jesus and children? So we move on to the next slide. How many people know some names for the devil? We've called him Satan already, Lucifer. Do you know he's called the accuser? Accuser of the brethren. What did Jesus say about him? Here's the best definition. The devil. Murderer from the beginning. He does not stand in truth. There is no truth in him. He is a liar and the father of lies. Everybody agree with that? I think Jesus was right on the money. And so speaking of lies, we move to the next slide. And we wonder about deception. We wonder about misleading. We wonder about chaos. These are from current headlines. These are things that you guys have all probably seen in the last at least 12 months. Not uncommon to turn on the news and see that. The question is, how does this affect us? And keep in mind, as we go through this study, he was the most subtle beast of the field, right? In our next slide, how many people saw this on the news? How many people have heard about the defund the police movement? A little bit weird sounding, right? If you defund the police, who do you call when a person's climbing through your window in the middle of the night, right? It doesn't seem very logical. I like this because whoever put this together for the news, they put this Democrat from Missouri, a representative, who has this quote up here. She says, today's decision to defund the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department is historic. It marks a new future for our city. And then underneath, if you can't see from down there, it's a little blurry, you've got these little pins there that show man shot, 2 shot, woman shot, 3 shot, man killed. I'm not making light of these tragedies, but it shows this contradiction. And so for those of us, which I think is about everybody in this room who looks and says, that makes no sense to defund the police. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. We go, look, there's the proof right there, right? Okay, so it doesn't make sense to me. Why are they doing this? And it causes a lot of confusion. There's a lot of deception. There's a lot of misinformation here. So we move on to the next slide. This is a little bit older mob scene. This is going to be France right after the Revolution, when they also saw lawlessness. By the way, their revolution was much different from ours. You'll understand in a minute why. Nothing like the American Revolution. J. Edgar Hoover, anybody know that name? J. Edgar Hoover, FBI. He was appointed to what became the FBI later, appointed in 1924 by Calvin Coolidge. He had a pretty good grasp on lawlessness. Now keep in mind, again, if you're ever in the cash cab, you're going to have to split your winnings with me. J. Edgar Hoover, why was he tasked by President Coolidge to run what later became the FBI? What was the biggest problem plaguing our country? No guesses? Close, you're on the right track. Mob gangsters, yeah. Yeah, he stopped men like Machine Gun Kelly and John Dillinger, right? After his successful campaigns to end these gangsters and robbing post offices and banks across the country, another president, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, tasks him with seeking out foreign spies, the espionage that was taking place here in America by communists. This was a big deal, especially after World War II. So J. Edgar Hoover, who by the way ends up becoming the head of the FBI until his death in 1972, longest serving director, he saw these lawless people at the root of their problem and identified them as a threat within. And I'm going to read you a couple of things he said. The root of the problem, he said, this is J. Edgar Hoover. This isn't Billy Graham or Billy Sunday. This is J. Edgar Hoover. And here's what he says. He says, the root of the problem is the criminal is the product of spiritual starvation. Someone failed miserably to bring him to know God, to love him, and to serve him. Can you imagine the director of the FBI today saying something like this? They'd run him out of the swamp on a pole, probably. Just a hunch. He said, a child who has been taught the laws of God should have little trouble respecting the laws of men. That's pretty good. I might get a bumper sticker that says that. He saw the danger in the rise of materialism, the decline of God, and of God-centered deeds and thoughts. Of the American home, he said, it has ceased to be a school of moral and spiritual education, and that when spiritual guidance is at a low ebb, moral principles are in a state of deterioration. He added, secularism advances when men forget God. So what happens when we forget God? We have this, we have the lawlessness. These are the Jacobins who overthrew France's government in the Revolution. And unlike here, the period that followed is known as the Reign of Terror. Thousands upon thousands died, usually at the guillotine. They were a lawless, anarchist group. Their ideas would later be embraced by people like Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, men who joined the Hegelian movement and advanced these ideals. To them, the ends justified the means. So when we look at some of these issues today, some of the confusion in the news, some of the things that really make us scratch our head, let me put it to you this way. Earlier in my career, and for the first several years of my career, usually when somebody would talk to me about my job, their question, pretty normal, they'd say, hey, I bet you see some weird stuff or funny stuff or you got any good stories. Now when I run into people, guess what they ask me? Their demeanor's totally changed. It's, oh man, how's the public treating you? How's it going, man? Are you doing okay? And I got to tell them, yeah, I'm doing great. Because I work in a city where I can't go in uniform to a restaurant without being in the awkward position of somebody buying my lunch. We're not allowed to accept gratuities. So I've had people walk up, I had an old man walk up, hand me $20 while I'm sitting at a table at a restaurant. I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to take that. And he wouldn't understand that. So are we really being attacked by the citizenry? No, we're not. In some places, there are some bad things happening to the police. But understand, the defund the police movement, the issue is not about defunding the police. Because their philosophy is, because the ends justify the means, their mantra is the issue is never the issue. So it's not about defunding the police. It's not about equality. It's not about voter ID. It's not about women's rights. It's not about any of those things that they tell you that it's about. And our next slide, I'll explain a little bit more of that. Our next slide, anybody ever heard of Machiavelli? Most people have not. We have a couple people here. You know who has heard of Machiavelli? Your politicians. Hillary Clinton quoted him here just in the last year to advance some democratic ideas she had. Her husband, when he was president, quoted an entire passage from the Oval Office. Rahm Emanuel, you remember him? Everybody remembers him for saying something about you never let a crisis go to waste. Well, he stole that from this. That's not his. These politicians have all studied Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1515, going back a little ways. His idea to unify Italy was unify at any cost. The ends justify the means. He had an idea called consequentialism. And that basically said there are no absolutes. Whatever you need to do to justify the end, it's based on how good that end is. And that's subject to the person carrying that out. So he knew that to take a city, he would make the people of that city hate him. They would despise him. But one of his tactics were, I'm going to hire criminals, thugs, serial arsonists, rapists, and I'm going to terrorize the populace. What they didn't know, as they're being terrorized by these thugs that he has hired secretly, is that he's going to come in and guess what he does to those same thugs? He eliminates them. The thing that Marilyn does to me in a few minutes, he does for real to them, right? And they're done. And then guess what? He's praised as the hero. Sound familiar? That's why these politicians study this today. Make no mistake, what they're doing, they might not be good, they might not be moral, but make no mistake, they are cunning. In fact, I would call them subtle, like that beast in the field. So if we move on to the next slide, most people aren't looking to find books written by people in 1515. So Saul Alinsky, hero of Barack Obama's, he wrote Rules for Radicals. Anybody heard of this? Rules for Radicals. So what he outlines in this book is some of the steps to overthrowing a government. And the first step starts with being able to organize requires disorganizing. So the easiest thing to do is to infiltrate a community, find out what rubs them wrong, expose those raw nerves, seek out controversies. If it's worth being controversial, it's worth exposing. And if you can fan the flames of those hostilities, you can work the people into overt expression. And then what happens? Then you have people burning down police stations, right? Now, I'm not trying to say the police are always right. I'm not trying to say one side is right and one side is wrong. I want you to see that there's an agenda. I'm hoping that a byproduct of what we do tonight is that you look at some of this stuff and say, okay, I see there's a design to this. I see that there's an enemy at work behind this. I'm not going to get worked up and fall for it. And ultimately, everybody in this room knows that we have our hope somewhere else, right? So if we move on to the next slide, we'll just break away with a little activity because we're talking about deception. We've got 4 headlines here. Can everybody see those? Israeli forces shoot dead 2 Palestinian in Al-Quds. That's from Press TV. Now, full disclosure, Press TV is the Iranian propaganda. They're not going to have anything nice about Israel, to be fair. Time magazine, not Iranian as far as we know. 2 Palestinians killed after stabbing attack. Does this shed light on anything? Do we know, were the Palestinians the ones stabbed? Were they the ones doing the stabbing? It's a little vague, right? Next headline, 2 Palestinians killed following stabbing attack in Jerusalem. CNN, our trusted CNN, just kidding. 2 dead in attack at Old City of Jerusalem. No mention at all who's involved, right? Let's go to the next slide. Here's the correction that several days later the New York Times printed after a lot of outcry. 2 Palestinian attackers killed, 2 Israelis die in Jerusalem. The Palestinians were terrorists armed with knives. and they were killed after they killed 2 Israelis. But even this correction is kind of misleading. Why is it Palestinians are killed, Israelis merely just die, right? See a little bit of a disproportion there? I threw this little cartoon, and if you can't see it, it's got a guy that wearing a suit, a news anchor, clearly. His little banner on his bandana says World Media, and in his little quote bubble, "This just in from Gaza." And he's wearing garb we would associate with Palestinians, of course. The next slide is my favorite when it comes to pictures painting 1,000 words. Our CNN artist depicting presumably a terrorist, and instead of holding a rifle and having blood on his hand, he looks really good in the painting. He's letting a dove go out from his hand. So what does this tell you? It tells you there's a little bit of bias, right? A lot of bias. But there's a reason for that. Our next slide. We don't get this anymore, right? Everybody here knows what this reference is, I hope. If you don't, do you know what it is? Are you the youngest person in the room right now? Yeah. Do you know who this is? Well, you're missing out. Missing out. If you want to see something a little more accurate and less misleading, here's another little sidebar for you. This is just a bonus. It's free. Dragnet and Adam 12. If you want to see a police drama, keep in mind this was designed as a pro-police show. He actually used real police calls. So at the end where they say these calls were real, the names were changed to protect the innocent, remember all that? That's because those are real police calls. That's why you could watch an episode of Adam 12, and on one call they're trying to get a cat out of the tree, and on the next call they've got a barricaded suspect with a gun, right? Because that's really how police work can be. You can have an entire night of boredom and then one call at the end of your shift and the world turns upside down. So anyway, that's free. That's not part of the Bible study. Just a little plug. Okay, but this next slide, we're going to do another little activity. This breaking news, it's not really breaking news. This picture actually is probably about 20 years old, believe it or not. So for our activity, make up your own headline. I'll give you a little help. That really is an IDF soldier. There are fakes out there, and there's usually giveaways. You know, they'll have a IDF soldier, but he's carrying an AK-47. That's not standard issue for the IDF. So there's a lot of fakes out there. This is a real picture. That's a real IDF soldier holding his truncheon or his baton, his impact weapon, and we see a bloodied man sitting in front of him. So somebody come up with a headline for this. What do you think it said? Something about police brutality, in this case IDF brutality. You're not far off, right? Anybody else? Well, I'll tell you what the New York Times said. The New York Times said, Palestinian attacked by Israeli soldier, right? Now, the funny thing about this story is that when they released it, a subscriber to the New York Times looked at it here in America and he said, "Son of a gun? I know that boy, the one sitting on the ground." He said, "That's Tuvia Grossman. He's a friend of my son's." He says, "He's a yeshiva student from Chicago. He's not a Palestinian." And then the real story comes out. Tuvia was visiting Israel and was attacked by Arabs who tried to murder him. This IDF soldier saved his life and then held the rest of the crowd at bay, which is pretty impressive considering what's he got drawn for his weapon, right? Taking his little baton to a big fight, right? But he saves his life. Now, the New York Times did print a correction a few days later, but was the damage done already? Sure, it was done. Absolutely, it was done. Let's go to the next slide while I grab my water. I'm getting a little dry. Pardon me. So this is pretty blatant. This is obviously propaganda, declaring in bold print the Israeli army using Palestinians as human shields. Kind of grips you. You see that artwork and all those colors. You see this terrified youngster being grabbed by this really insidious looking soldier here carrying a weapon. That's actually an American weapon. This says a lot. This picture paints 1,000 words also. The propaganda that's coming out today, by the way, that's anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli, it would make the Nazi propaganda machine of the 30s and Joseph Goebbels pretty jealous. It is ramped up to fever pitch if you didn't know. Let's go to the next slide real quick, because are the IDF using people as human shields? They are using shields, and this picture shows what shields they're using. This picture is an IDF soldier using his shield to help a Palestinian woman cross the street. This is a new picture. This is from last week. This is happening right now. Because as you know, Israel, maybe you don't know, we had a deacon mention it in his closing prayer for dismissal Sunday. Israel's under attack, hundreds of rockets. And you're not going to get all this on the news. I'll give you an example, just a personal one. A person I follow on Facebook, a friend on Facebook, has been posting the videos. He lives in Tel Aviv. And I tried to share one of those with Pastor. And in about the 2 or 3 hour time span before Pastor tried to open it, he was unable to open it. Because big tech is censoring that stuff, right? Anything that, in fact, some of the stuff, if you go to look up some of the slides, and get with me later, I'll tell you how I found these slides. You will not find them through Google. When you enter keywords to look for these kind of things, you're going to find a very misleading representation of Israel and how they're picking on the Palestinians, okay? So what's funny about this is not from a media outlet, a news source. Guess where I got this picture from? Speaking of big tech and censorship and people being misleading, I got it from Twitter. And the person that posted it was a Muslim. And let me read what they said. Their first name was Hussein. I won't give you the whole name. There's no reason to do that. And I also can't pronounce it. This person says, "God bless Israel!" Exclamation point. "God bless the IDF!" Exclamation point. This Ramadan, I pray that God opens the eyes of more Muslims. I want them to see what's really happening there. That's an earnest prayer.
I've heard on the radio just recently about ways to try to talk to people who buy into propaganda.
Yeah.
And like they talk about Israel picking
Yeah.
on the Palestinians, they stole their land and all this stuff.
Right.
So ask them where their government is.
Right.
Palestinian government. They've never had one. They've never had any kind of president or ruling body.
That's correct.
Any kind.
Right.
They are a people, but they have never actually owned any part of that area.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a lot of good information out. She brings up a good point. If you didn't hear, when it comes to talking with people and refuting, it's real easy. You bring up facts. Those pesky facts generally get in the way. A couple good sources for you. If you go to YouTube, unless they've taken this down, one of the former, I think he was Minister of the Interior, Danny Ayala, you can go to some of his pages. He's got some really good videos that explain the myth of the two-state solution. Some of the other misnomers that are out there that are being perpetrated largely on our university campuses, professors that are trying to brainwash young students into believing that things are happening that aren't happening over there and giving a false narrative about the history there. So I'm glad you brought that point up, because there is a false narrative when it comes to the history. If we can bring up the next slide, we're going to do another activity. Anybody know who this is?
Hanoi Jane.
You even got her nickname, Hanoi Jane. Pretty good. Pretty good. Who here does not know who Hanoi Jane is? Anybody here not heard of Hanoi Jane? It's okay if you didn't. We're talking late 60s, early 70s. Okay? Jane Fonda. Does that ring a bell? The actress Jane Fonda. This is her as a young lady, Hollywood starlet, daughter of Henry Fonda, sister to Peter Fonda. Around 1968, Jane Fonda started traveling with students, cut off all her hair, and started traveling with students to army bases to give anti-war leaflets to soldiers, right, service members. She went to protests, she went to rallies, things like that, and she was being very vocal about her opposition to what was happening in Vietnam, all right? She even had a little thing, she and Donald Sutherland, any movie buffs in here, Kiefer Sutherland's dad, they formed this anti-USO troop. Anybody know what the USO is? Anybody besides Steve? Steve knows what the USO is. All right, Bob Hope's USO. They formed the anti. Richard was in the Army. He knows what the USO is. They formed the anti-USO. They called the FTA, Free the Army, although it's a little tongue-in-cheek because F didn't really stand for free. We won't go into that tonight. Wrong setting. All of that paled in comparison in 1972. Guess what she did? She went to Vietnam. She went and visited, not to fight or to help. She went and visited the Viet Cong. If we go to the next slide, that picture was her on the tank. The picture on the right there is a picture with her. It's John Kerry, by the way. A lot of you know John Kerry. That's at an anti-war rally. She goes to Vietnam in 1972. She poses with the Viet Cong. She does radio addresses for the North Vietnamese. And to top it all off, here's the icing on the cake, she visits POWs. Dead serious. This really happened. I'm not making this up. This really happened. So when she comes back, she's labeled as a traitor. I remember as a kid, even in the late 70s and early 80s, we had a car in our neighborhood. The guy had a bumper sticker, and I always thought it was clever. It said, "Vietnam vets are not Fonda Jane." Get it? Pretty clever. Other people got clever with urinal targets. The guy right here is Hanoi Jane the traitor. So for our activity, I gave you that background because I knew there'd be a couple people that wouldn't have heard of her. But what if I told you that Jane Fonda, at the height of her career, grew up in the lap of luxury and stardom, that she loved America so much that she collaborated with the CIA to create a false narrative here, to make even Americans think that she was an anti-American, anti-war, communist-loving radical? What if I told you that? Well, I don't want to pick on her. I've actually heard that she's a Christian now. In fact, her ex-husband Ted Turner has talked about that being one of the reasons they broke up. She claims, and I hope she's a Christian today. Now, I will tell you that I've read articles. She does regret some of the things she did. As recently as 2005 at a book signing, a Navy veteran spit on her. So she's had invitations to go, why don't you go take pictures with ISIS now? That kind of stuff. In fact, I found these myself. These are real. There are still Facebook groups. I found 2 of them that are real, that are dedicated to hating, espousing hatred of Jane Fonda. Those are really out there. Yeah. She has apologized or expressed regret for posing with the soldiers on the tank or with that anti-aircraft gun, but she has never come out and said, "I'm sorry for everything that I did." To most veterans, and I don't want to speak for any Vietnam veterans, they can speak better than me. My impression is, from what I understand, is that there's still not a lot of love for Jane Fonda. Okay, and I could be wrong.
I heard the story that when she was in North Vietnam, near the POWs, that one of them gave her a note.
Passed her a message, yeah.
And she gave it directly to
Mm-hmm.
whoever.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, we couldn't get operatives in. We couldn't get anybody in. When our pilots went down, they were trapped. She had the only chance of getting in. So what do you think? Would you buy a urinal target with her face on it? Richard still would, because Richard knows that I'm lying right now. Richard knows that she really was an anti-American, anti-war, communist-loving radical. And you knew it too, because the whole time I was talking, I could see your face. Ron knew. And the whole reason I did this is because just for a minute, I wanted you to have to process that, just for a second, because that's what the media does to us. They blast these images at us, they give us this narrative, and on some level, we have to process that. That's why we're supposed to be prayerful, right? We're supposed to upon the mind of Christ, because we're getting bombarded with that stuff. We have to be discerning, right? She loved the attention. Right, and that's a problem in Hollywood. They love attention. So if we move on to the next slide, of course, we're bombarded with this all the time. These are more recent headlines. We've got the ELCA that has the first trans bishop on there. In our next slide, another hot topic: athletes, transgender athletes, men who are dominating women's sports because they are now identifying as women, right? Again, you see that, and it's just like with defund the police. You're like, what is going on here, right? But again, remember, the issue is never the issue. The people that are behind this, and make no mistake, they're being guided by the prince of this world. The issue is not the issue. The issue is really to mislead, right? It's smoke and mirrors. So, the question is, can we fix it? Who's winning right now? We see the misinformation on all these topics. What kind of answers? Of course, we have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to say. Obviously, our hope is in Jesus. If we go to the next slide, I want to go back to just a little bit, back to the basics. We talked about the first lie. Remember what that was? He cast doubt and he says, you won't really die, right? There were actually 2 lies that Satan told. Can anybody guess what the other lie was that he told at that moment? The first lie, he lied about God. We all agree with that, right? What was the second lie? Told him it could be God's. So his second lie was not a lie about God. He lied to Eve about Eve, right? Said you could be as a God. You'll be like God. He knows that if you eat that, you're going to be like a God. So he's telling Eve, see, you're incomplete. Right? Missing out. You're missing out, and God's holding back something from you. And if you do this, you're going to get it. He causes her to question who she is. Questioning identity, right? That's a huge problem today. Identity crisis, right? So this is our second lie. He's whispering to her, God made a mistake, Eve. There's more for you, right? We know God knew us from the womb. But he's saying, no, you were born a mistake. You really weren't supposed to be a boy. You should be a girl, or vice versa, or whatever he tells them. Maybe you should have been a kangaroo. I don't know. Whatever he wants to tell you, he will tell you because he wants you to think you're incomplete, right? Mm-hmm.
And said, what do you mean, what do I identify as? Well, we don't know, are you in, are you female,
Yeah.
or other? He said, well, if I can choose,
I'll just be a tree.
today. Okay, if I'm a tree today.
Yeah, that sounds something like my 7-year-old would say. Right.
He said, or do you need proof that I'm a
Right. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. We sound like a bunch of idiots. Chelsea had to sit through a whole bunch of stuff today, things you can't ask for her company. The weirdest things that you wouldn't think it would be totally harmless, just routine conversation that you dare not ask because it'll get you sued, right? We've really just become crazy, just foolish, right? All right, so instead of having to look at these pictures, obviously there's a bunch of craziness there, but I want to go to the next one. We can go to this one and then the next one. You guys have all seen Caitlyn Jenner and transgenders who read at the libraries of children. We know that's of the devil. But it's not just in the world, guys. We have it in the church, too. And again, this isn't to pick on anybody in particular, but how about the prosperity gospel? How about this promise that, okay, you're going to church, but man, you're sick. What's wrong with you? That you'd be sick, or that you can't pay a bill, or that you don't have a nice car, or anything like that. God must be holding back from you. It must be you. I guess you're incomplete, right? You've got sin in your life. Yeah. We know this stuff won't really make you happy. We don't know from personal experience. I don't have a car or a house like that, but I don't have a suitcase full of money. But we hear plenty of stories that tell us that this stuff doesn't make people happy. I think the people, and again, I'm not trying to single anybody out, but these are people up here that teach they preach a gospel that says you're missing out, that you can have more. So it has infiltrated the church somewhat. So we're still asking the question, how does it get fixed? And why isn't it getting fixed? I guess that's more important. The world is in rebellion against God. Exactly. Consequentialism. The absolutes are out the window. And they're very narcissistic about it. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be safe to say that Lucifer is probably the most narcissistic creature ever, right? Okay. So let's go to the next slide for a minute, because I want to talk a little bit in our remaining few minutes about the human condition. This slide didn't turn out too well. If you can't make it out, this depicts, it's not a real picture, it's a painting. This is ancient Egypt. These are the frogs, plague number 2, right? We're going back to Exodus 8. Everybody remember the plagues? All right, and here's the frogs that come in. And you got them in the beds, you got them in the house, you got them in the ovens, for crying out loud, right? The floor is completely covered. Ava saw this picture. She said, the carpet looks green, Dad, because of all the frogs. And it probably would have been if there was carpet, whatever it was on the floor. What's interesting about this is, well, first of all, let me give you a little history here. Does anybody understand the relationship between Egyptians and frogs? They were sacred. You probably knew that much, right? Frogs were sacred to the Egyptians, so they couldn't kill these frogs. It'd be hard to not step on frogs if you can imagine this infestation. They had a god. The god was Heket, portrayed, represented fertility. And actually, interesting enough, and this is where I think God really does have a sense of humor. God, the god, small g, Heket, was later associated through the story of Osiris with resurrection of all things. So I like to think that God said, oh, I can use this, because he's got a sense of humor. You want to talk resurrection? You want to make a mockery out of resurrection? Check this out. All right? So you have this nasty, disgusting thing. Oh, think about this too, by the way. There's got to be frogs dying. It's got to be disgusting. It's got to be pretty gross, right? Right? Once in a while, one of our cats will kill a frog and lay it at our porch. I can't imagine that magnified by millions and millions. All right? A couple interesting things about this encounter. Excuse me, out of all the plagues. Pardon me. Does anybody remember the face-to-face that Moses had with Pharaoh following this, where he acquiesced, where he said, yeah, I'll let you go sacrifice? Bob, you remember?
Yeah, Moses said, when would you like me to put them away?
When would you like me to take them away?
And I heard a sermon entitled, One More Night with the Frogs.
Right.
It's going to come
Right.
out.
He said, yeah, he had one more night with the frogs, because his answer was, Moses affirmed that, yeah, God will take care of this frog problem. In fact, Moses makes it clear that God is so in tune with the ecosystem, he'll say, I'll get rid of all the frogs. Well, not the ones that the river needs. The ones that go to the river, they'll be in the river. But he even gives him the honor of saying, Pharaoh, when do you want these gone? And his answer, what would your answer be? Lonnie, you're infested with frogs. When do you want them to go? Right now. Right now. Right now. You can't call the Orkin, man. There is no Egyptian Orkin. You can't get a pest control guy. But when do you want God to make these go? Right now. But weirdly enough, he says tomorrow. And Bob brings it up. One more night with the frogs. And that's our human nature, is that we say, just a little longer, right? Just whatever that sin is. Just a little more time. And it doesn't have to be frogs, certainly. What could it be? What's it in your life, in your past, present, whatever it may be? One more night with pornography? One more night with alcohol? Maybe one more night in an adulterous relationship. I'll fix it tomorrow, right? But I don't want to focus on that. Let's think a few verses back, because we asked ourselves this question. Remember the question I asked. How do we fix it? Can we fix it? Do you remember, if you remember the story, we won't go take the time to read it, but in this same story, before as the frogs are invading, I should say, those Egyptian magicians, Pharaoh turns to them, they're going to address the problem, right? Let's go to the next slide real quick. Anybody know what Egypt represents in the Bible? You want to help them out, Bob? The world. Egypt is a representation. We can all associate with Pharaoh. We've all been in that place, regardless of how big or little we think the sin was. We've all been in that place where we still continue in that sin for another season, right? None of us can escape that. But how about this idea of the world fixing the problems? That we can turn to the secular rehab, we can turn to the psychologist, we can turn to the medication, we can turn to Dr. Fauci, maybe I shouldn't have said that. We can turn to whomever, and they will fix our problems, right? But what happened when those magicians decided to address that? You got God right there, you got Moses. You've already seen the staff turn into a serpent. Of course, these magicians duplicated. The river turned to blood, they duplicated that too. But you've got access to the God of heaven, you're the Pharaoh, and you got Moses and Aaron right there who are looking at each other going, did he just say tomorrow? As frogs are climbing up their gowns and everything else. Yeah, he said tomorrow. I can't believe he said tomorrow. When Pharaoh had asked his magicians, or when his magicians interceded, they made more frogs. You remember that? They make more frogs. So when we turn to the world, we only compound our problems. That's exactly what we do. There's only one place we can turn, of course, to, and we know where that is. If we go to the next slide, because I don't want to be too heavy, obviously, but Jesus said, "These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So that's our hope, right? Paul encourages us in 1 Corinthians 1:25. He says, "Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." That means on your worst day, no matter what's going on around you, as a believer, you have access to more power in you through Christ than any devil in this world. Even if he's the prince or little g God of this world, right? So as we close in this last slide, I reference Revelation 5. I encourage you guys to read this. It's beautiful. One of my favorite books is Ruth. It goes hand in hand with this, the scroll and the lamb. So how is it going to be fixed? We know that eventually God's redemptive plan is going to come to fruition, and we can see a beautiful illustration of this in Revelation 5. You remember this? You remember this when John looks up, he sees the scroll that no one is worthy to take, no one is worthy to open. Who's worthy to open it? The Lamb of God. Before that, John doesn't know, because no one is worthy, and it's declared all through the heavens. No one is worthy. No man. Emily brought it up in the beginning. Nobody. Not one righteous. Not a single one. Paul kind of emphasized that a lot. Not one. Zilch. Zero, he says. Nada. John openly weeps at this news. And John understands. I picked this picture because it's got the scrolls, the seals across it. This is a good representation of the deed that the kinsman redeemer would have had. It's also common in first century Rome. So any reader would have envisioned this scroll with writing on two sides. And a lot of scholars say this actually is the title deed to the earth. What's that mean? The title deed, think about that for a second. Just before we close, think about that for a second. That we talked about that landlord relationship, that tenant who was entrusted with authority, and then he turns it over. We had the same thing that happened, just as with one man, sin entered the world through him, right? He turned that authority over to Lucifer. But God is going to redeem it, because guess what? He's got the title. He holds the title deed. He's the only one worthy to open it. So this is where our hope really is. When you guys see the news, keep praying for the police. Keep praying for people throughout the world that are being persecuted. Persecution is real. It's happening to not just police. It's happening to Christians. It's happening to Muslims in China, for crying out loud. We have these powers behind these nations that are making people do evil things, governments that are doing evil things, so don't stop praying for that. But remember where our hope is. Just don't get discouraged as you watch the news and you say, man, I can't believe they're defunding the police. Man, I can't believe they got 50-year-old men dressed up as Judy Garland reading to 6-year-olds in the library. I can't believe that's happening. It's easy to get discouraged and to get wrapped up in that stuff. But understand, it's happening because this world is under the control temporarily, limited power, right? Limited power, but that's all going to change. And this is when it changes. That's where our hope is. So I hope you enjoyed this night. I hope you got a little bit out of it. And anybody have any questions on anything we've got? I didn't get the off with your head yet. I got 4 minutes. Any questions? You guys are like, no, it's still beautiful outside. Let's leave. Okay, well, that gives you extra time to dig for your dollars. These dollars are going towards Starting Point. So I predict you'll give 4 times the amount that you usually give, because we're 4 minutes early. All right. Marilyn, you had something?
We've got some
Eggs.
refrigerators.
Okay. Okay, help yourself to eggs. There's a bunch of them in the kitchen. Last commercial I'll do. Please pray for Israel. Okay? Anything you can do to support Israel. Everybody sees the rockets, hundreds a day that they're shooting out of the sky. It costs money to destroy those rockets. They've got to replenish their system, their Iron Dome that they use to keep those. And of course, who's being targeted? Civilians. Okay.
And the country now is not as supportive of Israel. We're not supporting them like the old administration.
Excellent point. The last administration supported Israel. This one doesn't.
From America, they were.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And they've danced around it. The press secretary for the White House has been directly asked that question and has danced around it with her circle back response that when they put the question to her, are you going to help them replenish? So anything you can do. And the easy way to do that, guys, we have a very tiny selection of Israeli products that you might find over at Kroger if you're looking for kosher foods or things like that. But you can go online. Just so you know, we could do a whole different study another time. And since we got a couple minutes, I'll just tell you this. Israel has a disproportionate amount of goods and services they've provided to the world. Who here has a cell phone with them right now? Okay, you can thank Israel. Who here has any devices in their heart that may have saved their life? Okay, more than likely it was designed, if not made in Israel. All right, so everything from SodaStream to the way your voicemail works, Israel has created these things because God said what to Abraham? He said that, remember Genesis? Back to Genesis, the book that Dell hates. The world will be blessed through you. Right? Right. They're going all over the world, by the way. We used them in Katrina. They came here. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, were some of the first responders from outside of the United States to Katrina. So they're doing wonderful things to the world. Take a look sometime, just for the heck of it. Look at Nobel Prize winners who either are from Israel or Jewish, essentially the seed of Abraham that's blessing the world to this day, and look at the number of Nobel Prize winners. Okay? So if you guys will pray about this, please try to support Israeli products. There's Israeli ministries. I can give you the name of the person that I'm friends with on Facebook. He is a Christian of Jewish birth. At 19 years of age, he gave his heart to Christ. He has a ministry. So pray about it. And if you find it in your heart, if the Lord leads you to support Israel, they're going to need some stimulation in their economy. They're in a very difficult situation right now. Okay? All right. Anything else? Any other announcements that I'm missing? Okay. Okay, all right, I'll close in prayer and then we can all head out and enjoy this beautiful weather. Our Heavenly Father, we're so grateful tonight that we had the opportunity to assemble and to be in fellowship, Lord. Lord, please let us hear what you have to say. Let the church hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Lord, we ask for wisdom, we ask for guidance, we ask for the things that we know that we need that you'll provide. We ask you for protection from the enemy. Make us aware, make us able to discern. Lord, we anticipate your coming and the great hope that's in you, and for the day that you will redeem this world, and that you'll set right, and that the great reset really is in you, not in man, not in governments, and certainly not this world. We ask for protection and peace as you take us to our homes, that we can return here safely and worship you for the next time. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, thanks guys. Thanks for listening. Okay. Thanks, Bob.